Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate you attending our webinars. Let me introduce myself. I'm Joel McIntosh. I'm the publisher at Proof Rock Press. We're very grateful for you being here today. I know this is after a busy day for you. Thank you for joining us and taking 30 minutes of your time. We'll keep this short, 30 minutes. Let me tell you a little bit about the Zoom interface. First of all, you can see our video. We cannot see yours, and you can hear us, but we can't hear you. It's a webinar, so no concerns about that. There is a Q&A box on the bottom of the Zoom interface. If you double click on that Q&A box, you'll get a little pop-up, and you can ask questions. I would like to encourage you to please pose questions to Christine Fonseca after I introduce her. This is kind of a Q&A format. I'll be able to, do a bit of the interview, but I genuinely hope you will join us in the conversation and ask some questions of your own as we go through there. Feel 100% to pop those questions in at any time. Don't wait till the end because they'll just pop up on our text screen and we can see the question, and then we can address it as is appropriate. So feel free to throw in questions at any time. The objectives of these webinars, these are going to be very informal. We just want you a chance to meet with our authors. It's a chance to have a discussion with authors on topics that are important to you and to the author, and really think of this as kind of an enrichment opportunity for people who've bought the book. This isn't a sales pitch or anything like that. We're really just wanting to provide a nice opportunity for you to interact with the author on an important topic. In this case, the author is Christine Fonseca. She has written The Caring Child. And let me tell you what, let me do this real quick. Let me throw up the cover of that book. So The Caring Child is about building empathy and emotional intelligence in children and how to go about doing that. But let me tell you a little bit more about Christine Fonseca. She is an award-winning author. She's written 9 books for Proof Rock Press. She is had been a school psychologist for 17 years. She's taught parenting classes for more than a decade. She is a social emotional consultant for schools. She has a vast amount of background in social emotional issues, as well as issues revolving kids in school. I would like to mention before I have Christine describe the book that this is a book that I would say primarily targets parents, but it has a lot of practical information for teachers as well. So whether you're a parent or a teacher who's joined us for this webinar, I think you're going to find some practical information regardless. Christine, let me introduce you and ask you to tell us a little bit about the book, The Caring Child.
Well, I'm so excited to be here first off, so thank you so much for this. The Caring Child really came about as a result of me trying to figure out why today's kids seem to be really struggling with their social emotional development and empathy. And in doing some research around today's generation of kids and the obstacles that they're facing, I really found this dichotomy in how they were developing their social and emotional skills. And so The Caring Child really seeks to address that and talks about how empathy develops in the brain, what we can do as parents or as educators to help foster that development and help create a more caring world, really.
Oh, that makes sense. In your book, in the upfront material, you spend a little time defining what in your mind is empathy for kids and what is compassion for kids. And you also talk a little bit about self-compassion. Can you kind of talk about those definitions?
Absolutely. So I found it really interesting when I was doing the research for the book that a lot of researchers are not on the same page in how they're defining empathy and compassion. And so for me, those are two terms that live on the same spectrum. Empathy, fully realized empathy in my mind, is not only the ability to feel another person or to look at the world through another person's lens, but to be able to do so in such a way that doesn't create harm to self. So I can feel your feelings without becoming distressed by your feelings. I learn boundaries and kind of where I start and stop and where you start and stop. Self-compassion is really that ability to apply that same skill inward. So to be able to understand and recognize my feelings from a place of compassion, from a place of kindness, instead of constantly kind of belittling myself for the ways I might be showing up on the world, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. I had this realization. Gosh, this was about a year ago. I do some long distance biking, and I caught myself doing a lot of negative thinking about myself and about stupid things that I had done in the past. And it dawned on me that one of the reasons that I was doing that at that moment was that I was bored. And
Mm-hmm.
and negative thinking
Yeah.
about yourself is incredibly engaging.
It is really, and how sad is that, right? Like that we're not nearly as engaged with like, these are my goals today, and this is how I'm going to uplift things today. But we get so into the drama of the noise in our mind that's negative. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So in the early part of the book, in the introduction, I think you talk about some things that you've seen happening in schools with kids that you have found that kids today, this Generation Z, or
Mm-hmm.
you call them
iGen.
iGen, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
uh, tend to be more tolerant of
Mm-hmm.
differences and other kids, but they have become, or you've seen this trend towards them being less emotionally flexible,
Mm-hmm.
and perhaps even at times less compassionate.
Yeah.
What do you think is the underlying cause of that?
I think there's a few things. This generation, starting with Generation Z or iGen, and even going into the generation following them, which are our little babies that are in K12 Generation Alpha. I'm really seeing kind of an impact from technology. We know that from a lot of the research. That technology, one of the things that has happened, the unforeseen consequences of a lot of technology use has been this decrease in our social emotional learning skills, in particular in kids, as it starts to disrupt development of those skills. And so I think that's coming into play. I also think there are some other things coming into play, but really what I'm seeing in kids is this lack of emotional flexibility and this rigid thinking that starts to get in the way. And so they're tolerant and yet they're rigid, which is this weird dichotomy that's kind of happening. And they spout off about wanting to be more positive and be more optimistic. And yet at the same time, there's this unwillingness to feel big emotions that I see a lot of them demonstrate, which then causes all kinds of other hardships because we're not really recognizing that human beings have this huge range of emotions and all of these emotions are appropriate. It's our coping skills might not always be appropriate, but the emotions themselves aren't the issue. And I think our kids are struggling to know that.
So I was thinking about this idea that you bring up in your book of emotional resilience as
Mm-hmm.
well. Are the things we just talked about, are they also related to this idea of emotional
Yeah.
resilience?
Yeah. So resiliency is really born from kind of all of our social emotional skills operating optimally, right? And so when our brain is in peak performance with those kinds of skills, we get all this really good integration with all the kind of ways that our brain processes information. When things happen, be it trauma, be it related to adversity, stress on the brain that disrupts that integration, our resiliency gets disrupted as well, because resilience is the biology of resiliency is really just this extreme integration in the brain. So yeah, those are all super tied together. And so as we see resiliency goes down, it shouldn't be at all surprising that we also see empathy being compromised or other aspects of maybe executive functioning being compromised. Like all of these things are tied together.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about the executive functioning piece.
Mm-hmm.
That ability to process through an experience and then step back from it
Yeah,
and be able to then have empathy for another person.
right.
That is a thinking process as much as it is an
Yes.
emotional process.
Yeah. So it involves both emotional processes, but it also involves cognitive regulation and cognitive processes. And so it's a dance, right? Between our emotional selves and our social selves and our cognitive selves, and how all of those kind of interact together to form empathy.
Absolutely. So tell me a little bit about from your book and from your experiences as parents and also as teachers, what are some things we can do to teach kids to recognize, acknowledge, show empathy in healthy ways?
Yeah. So one of the big things in the book that I try to get across is that all of us have a million opportunities in any given day, whether we're an educator or a parent, to model and to build strong empathy skills in our children. And a lot of times we just don't realize that those are opportunities, and so we don't make use of them. So kind of one of the things I talk about is that narration, right? That inner narration of what's happening. And so if we as adults can start literally saying out loud what our thinking is and how we're regulating our emotions, that can really help kids. It provides a model. And one of the examples I like to use, it's the holiday season. And so there's a lot of hustle and bustle, and people are cutting people off on the roads, and we might have some feelings about that emerge. Instead of keeping all of that in your head, bring that out a little bit. You know, when somebody cuts you off in the parking lot at Target, for example, it's okay to say, oh, wow, like that person forgot there were other people here, like who also they need to share the road with. And I have some feelings about that, and that makes me really mad, but I don't want to be mad, so I should probably regulate that. And say all that out loud. Let your kids hear that. Have a conversation around that. Like, what's something I can do, kids, to calm down? Like, that makes me mad. So that they can see that you as an adult get mad, and that's normal. And that's fine. It's what we do with it that matters. And so what are some things we can do to change mad into something else? All of that starts building that emotional repertoire, our emotional skills and our thinking skills. All of that then starts building our empathy skills. Another thing that we can do is game night. Like, I think game night's the best thing ever. And if you've never done it, start it. If you have done it, keep doing it and pick some new games. But something as easy as Apples to Apples, that is really a game that can build linguistic skills, can also develop social emotional skills and develop perspective taking. Because strategically, to do well in Apples and Apples, you got to anticipate what the other people are going to put out with their cards. And so that's perspective taking. I have to learn to get into the perspective of another person to be able to anticipate what they might do. All of those will build your social emotional skills
And
and
I
your
bet,
empathy.
yeah, and you mentioned in the last webinar we did that things like Cranium or some of the,
Yeah.
you know, the games where you're acting out roles and
Creativity
that's right.
skills, taboo. There's a game called Quelf that's a lot of fun. Like, all of these games that are improvisational in nature or creative in nature build different aspects of social emotional learning skills. So in addition to just having fun and building the relationships in families that I think we don't do as intentionally as maybe we used to. So in addition to doing that, which does a lot to help kids, we're also just flat out building the skills themselves in this really fun and dynamic way for everybody.
How, when you're thinking about, one of the things that you talk about in your book is, I mean, this first part you've talked about modeling
Mm-hmm.
externally your own thinking processes so the kids see that happening.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also a section in your book where you talk about the kind of questions that you ask kids.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about those, the kind of questions that are best for having kids ferret out their thinking or their feelings?
Absolutely. So the last third of the book are all role plays. And I decided to use that methodology to really show what a subtle shift it is between kind of a typical conversation we might have with children versus one that can start building those skills a little more. And so an example I like to use a lot in parenting classes and when I'm working individually with parents is that whole idea of, how was your day today, that we often do when kids come home. And as you're a parent, Joel, if you ask that question, what are you going to get? Fine. Today's fine. Like, that's all you're going to get. If instead you say, tell me one great thing that happened today, or one thing you're grateful for today, or tell me something that made you laugh today, or tell me something that made you frustrated today. Those are going to solicit completely different conversations. And within those conversations, open up other opportunities to maybe kind of build and develop some other kinds of skills. It causes kids to think about their day differently, to reflect on their day in a really specific way. And if it's something you're not used to doing doing as a family, you could really be surprised by the kinds of conversations that can happen as a result. And the more frequently you do this, the more your kids kind of get primed to have that kind of conversation with you. It becomes very normal in your household. And so the next thing you know, that's just the way you guys talk with each other in this really deep level that starts building all of these social emotional learning skills. And it's happening in a way that's so organic. You don't even realize it's happening until all of a sudden your kids start demonstrating some skills to you you didn't even know they had, which is a fun time as a parent. I can distinctly remember that with my own children when they were young.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I actually I want to hold on to one thought, but I wanted to mention that you can, even in the same family, I think the conversations that my two boys have with their mom, and the conversations they have with me, or
Hmm.
you'd think they had different days, they were different
Yeah.
people or something,
Yep.
so,
It's
and
so
they're
true.
they're more open with their mom,
Hmm.
who's asking and probing, and they feel able to be vulnerable
Yeah.
with her in maybe a
Take
way that,
risks.
yeah, yeah. I was thinking that maybe we could talk a little bit about something that implicitly in the answers you've given have been this idea that we're talking about, or explicit, we're talking about empathy, but we're really talking about emotional health and overall
Mhm.
emotional health. How
Yeah.
is overall emotional health related to your ability to have empathy?
I would say it's highly related. When we think about emotional wellness or mental wellness, one of the things we're thinking about is full maturation of our social and emotional and cognitive regulation skills, right? It's again, it's that combination of all of those things together. And so I think as we practice things that build or sustain our emotional health, at the same time, what we're doing is we're kind of shoring up and maturing that empathy and that resiliency as well. And to be an empathetic person, you have to be able to not only understand who you are, so you have to have self-awareness and be able to regulate your own emotions, which would be emotional or self-regulation, but you have to recognize that other people exist too. And you have to understand that they have needs and rights and wants and desires separate and unique from your own, but every bit is valid. And you have to understand that, my emotional construct begins here and ends here, and yours starts here and ends there. And all of that stuff has to come into play just to be healthy emotionally, but it also is necessary to actually develop the type of empathy I'm talking about, which is the kind that doesn't harm you. There's some really interesting, in fact, I just read an article just the other day about empathy being a harmful thing and not a thing to strive for. And in my mind, what they're really talking about is the kind of empathy that occurs absent emotional boundaries or absent thinking skills, which I would agree. You can get into emotional distress from other people. Absolutely. But when we are mature in the development of all of that, that's not what we're talking about. And to me, empathy is the maturity of having boundaries, having that regulation, as well as being able to see the world from somebody else's perspective.
Boy, and that's hard. The setting the boundaries piece is
Mhm.
hard. And
Absolutely.
how do you, I'm throwing one out at you, like, well,
That's okay.
thinking about that, how do you talk through that with your kids? How do you help them understand that okay, that there is this value that we have of empathy, but you've
Mhm.
also got to be able to set some boundaries about that. You can't absorb that in, that can't be harmful to you.
Right. So I think sometimes it's really around helping kids understand what it means to be caring for another individual. Do you actually, when you want to help another person, right? When you're in service to another person, are you actually in service to that other person if you are in pain? Like, can you actually do those two things at once? Can you be in pain and still serve somebody else? And if you're serving somebody else from a place of pain, are you actually serving somebody else? Are you actually doing what you wanted to do? And those are hard, advanced concepts for kids. And so it's you just keep going back to it. And I think using characters like from a movie or from a book that they enjoy can be a great way to start talking about it. I'm thinking of the different characters in Winnie the Pooh, even something as mundane as that. Each of those characters represent different aspects of social emotional development. So it'd be really easy to use the characters from Winnie the Pooh to be able to talk about empathy and empathy development, and when is it appropriate, when is it not, when it becomes harmful, when does it become toxic, and what do you need to do to kind of shift from toxic to non-toxic, and that kind of thing. So I think it's these are hard concepts to talk about, but I don't think they're impossible concepts. And I think they're really important. And the younger we can start those conversations, obviously in ways that your kids will understand, the better for the kids' development and for your own development as a parent.
That makes sense. I would love to go down that rabbit hole with you because well, because that one thought I had was that, and it's also a little bit about practicing, you know, that
Yeah,
letting, and kids will screw it up sometimes, and then
of
they'll
course.
rebound with resilience, and then come back and hit
Yep.
it again. I do have a couple of questions that are from the audience. One
Hmm.
is Beth. Beth is from North Dakota, and that's one
Awesome.
of the things that's neat about these webinars. People are from all over the world.
Yeah,
We
I
have
love
folks from
that.
Australia and Romania.
I love
It's
it.
wonderful. Yeah. So she says, I'm sure these strategies work well for all kids, but are there extra insights or considerations for gifted kids when developing empathy, especially those with emotional intensity?
Yeah, so one of the more common things with gifted kids is emotional intensity, and that's a two-edged sword, right? Because part of being so intense emotionally means that you really can start to understand the feelings and perspective of another person. One of a great definition I once heard of empathy is it's emotional imagination, as is how somebody described empathy once, which I think is fantastic, and I think lends itself to this conversation around giftedness really good. Where it becomes a problem with young gifted kids in particular is that whole idea of boundaries and emotional distress. And so with gifted kids, the thing I would really focus on with them is social awareness, is really starting to develop theory of the mind, which is that ability to understand where I start and stop and where somebody else starts and stops, and that these are separate, they're different. You can start that with characters in a storyline, and then you can transfer it to me versus you. And I think that's probably the way I would do it with gifted kids. But absolutely, you're going to want to emphasize the thinking skills aspect of this, which the good news is with gifted kids, they have really good thinking skills. You just have to tap into them and start linking it all together for them early on.
I'm gonna that makes perfect sense. And for this next question,
Mm-hmm.
let me modify it a little bit because it's a great question. Gifted children often struggle with perfectionism, and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes they can be perceived as lacking of empathy because they can't see the other's perspective even though they want to. How can you work through these issues? But if you wouldn't mind in answering this question, include gifted, but also maybe kids from who have on the spectrum who
Yeah.
also have some of those issues.
Sure, sure. So neurodiversity, one of the things that many students who are neuroatypical, like a gifted student or a student with autism, child with autism, might share in common is that rigidity when it comes to understanding others' perspective. And I think sometimes that's not exactly what's happening. I think certainly in the case of a child with autism, really what's going on isn't so much a failure to understand perspective, it's a failure to understand where you lie within that perspective taking, and a failure to understand, again, that social awareness piece of where do I start and stop and where does somebody else start and stop. And so really that's the part that has to get just overemphasized over and over and over. I like using characters for that. With a child who is gifted or a student who's on the spectrum who might be really struggling with this, rather than say, how would that make you feel, which might be really difficult for them to do, it's let's pretend you're a character. Let's pretend that that part of your brain, let's give it a name. Let's make a whole persona around it. Let's say she's Jane, okay? How would Jane feel about that? How would Jane feel about that? Oftentimes a kid can do that. A kid can do that really readily. Even students who struggle with perspective taking where they can't necessarily personalize it. And so you can do that for a while until you start to develop some maturity in that part of the brain processing. And then you can switch it over to, okay, Jane has served her purpose. Now what would you do? Let's integrate Jane back into the rest of you. How would the rest of you feel about that? How would you approach it? I want to tackle the perfectionism little piece that came up in that question as well.
Mm-hmm.
Perfectionism is a really interesting thing. And I think part of the issue with perfectionism in gifted kids as it relates to empathy and social emotional development really has to do with the adults in this scenario misunderstanding what that perfectionism really is. So this is how I like to talk about it. Perfectionism is just the negative or immature version of high performance standards. We want our kids to have high performance standards. We want them to want to do the very, very best. We hold all kinds of people to that standard. I think it's perfectly okay to allow gifted kids to want to do that as well. The problem comes when there is a disconnect between what they think they want to be able to do and their actual skill to be able to do it. And when that disconnect happens, they can't realize the thing they're trying to do, and the perfectionism snaps in and they don't have strong coping skills. And so now we're stuck. Now it's a problem. When that occurs, that's a different issue. That's not about perfectionism. That's about our ability to cope with stress. And it's about how rigid our brain gets and how locked down our brain gets when it gets stressed out. So rather than view some of this as a problem of perfectionism, which is just high performance standards, why not view this as a problem of coping strategies, and then really work to teach coping strategies and teach self-awareness and make a stronger emotional vocabulary to talk about how nuanced our emotions are. I think you're going to get farther if you approach it that way.
That makes a great deal of sense. And you think about how vocabulary can drive your thinking about your own emotions, and having that rich
100%.
vocabulary that you talked about earlier is give some nuance to different kinds of emotions and
Yeah.
understanding of those emotions. Well, Christine, let me take a break and ask the audience if there are any other questions, because we're coming down to the end of our time here, and I'm gonna while I'll let that simmer there. I'm gonna show you guys some of the books that Christine has done for us at Proofrock Press. So if you go to the Proofrock website, proofrock.com, you just type into the search box Christine's name, as I've done here, Christine Fonseca. You can see all of the books she's done. She's done so many wonderful books on kids who are introverted, raising shy kids. She's done a curriculum for understanding the social emotional needs of gifted. Her book, Emotional Intensity in Gifted Students, is one of our most popular books. It's perennial
One of my
selling.
favorites too.
Yeah, and it sells really well. It's a wonderful book. The Caring Child is the one that we've been talking about today. And then Christine has a new book, Healing the Heart, which is about helping kids recover from trauma. That will be out in March. I don't see any additional questions. So let me wrap this up. Christine, thank you so much for. Whoa, I got one just coming through. When you mention the ability to cope with stress, I'm wondering, in your opinion, how does being in the out of doors foster resilience and social and emotional skills?
I think being outside is fantastic, and we don't do it nearly enough. Especially if when we are outdoors, we can unplug from our technology at the same time. So, being outdoors, talking on your phone or checking your Facebook status probably isn't going to have the same impact as just taking a hike. But here's the beauty of being outdoors. Not only are you getting an opportunity for fresh air and some grounding, like there's been some pretty good research on the somatic effects of just grounding, getting your feet and your hands back in nature, touching the ground, touching plants, those kinds of things. So you get this kind of neurological impact and dopamine hit that can happen from that. That's going to cause you to relax a little bit. But being outdoors does a few other things as well. When you are taking a hike, oftentimes you are only thinking about the hike, the things that are in front of you. You are practicing some mindfulness. You're actually in the moment. You might be engaged in a conversation, like a in-person one, which, you talk to kids and you talk about in-person conversations and they'll look at you like you're a little strange. They don't really know what those are. And so you have these in-person conversations where you can build connections with preferred adults or preferred caregivers. All of that can really do a lot to release the stress on the brain, reactivate the front part of the brain, our cortex, and kind of get that rational thinking back online. So I am a huge proponent for having opportunities to get out, unplug, and get back in nature a little bit.
And absolutely true for adults as well as kids.
100%.
Yeah, yeah,
100%.
absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Christine, for taking time to visit with us, and for all the folks who've attended the webinar. Thank you for coming. I know this is a holiday season, and I so appreciate your time as well. I will follow up with an email with a link to Christine's book, her bio, her blog, and some ways that you can get in contact with her on Twitter and that sort of thing. Look for that email in the next 24 hours or so. Thank you so much, Christine. We really
My
do
pleasure.
appreciate you coming here. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Absolutely.